here. I live 10 blocks that way, and I've lived here for about 30 years since I started at UC Santa Cruz, where I majored in everything. But eventually, after like 7 years, I got a creative writing degree, and I've since gone on to do a lot of different jobs. What's interesting about being here is that the number of people I don't know is kind of surprising to me. I think most of my business life has been over the hill. But the number of people whose names I recognize is amazing. It's like, I don't even know how I learned everybody's names. I mean, you must be in the newspaper all the time because I recognize so many. So, my name's Lindsley. I work for Cisco Systems. For people who may not know, Cisco Systems builds the software and the hardware that the internet runs on. So, you've never sent an email or looked at a web page that didn't somehow go over our stuff. We're pretty big. We are about 65,000, so we're about the same size as the city of Santa Cruz, which I think that some of the business problems I face might be similar to the business problems that are faced by the Chamber of Commerce. Very large place. We're in 148 countries, though, so we're very distributed. And my role there is I'm the manager of business architecture, and I'm that for HR. There's about 20 people like me. One of the nice things about working for my slides keep advancing on their own, which is giving away like the whole story here. I'm just going to put it down. You tell me if John Boyd shows up again. So my job as a manager of business architecture is like, working for a big company. There's about you can have some specialties, and my specialty is business architecture, which is about translating the strategy of the company into operations, and making sure that the operations of the company can live up to the strategy. There he is. You saw that. I didn't touch it. I just put it over there. Yeah, it's a teaser. So in that role, a lot of times it's possible to see a very specific thing that your company is doing and understand how it's going to influence your the operations of your company. So for instance, if you're going into a brand new market, you can say, look, I know what that market is, and my job is to maintain models of how the company works and understand how the company needs to change based upon going to that market. But some of the changes are very ambient. So they're not specific to Cisco, they're specific to business. Everybody is, or at least many of the people in this room are probably feeling them. So changes in market demographics, emerging technologies that change the way we deliver what we do, new competition from overseas. There are all these different big things that are happening that make us have to think about how we change operations to live up to the challenges. And so in dealing with those, there's not a simple, there we go. So dealing with those, there's not a real methodology. I turn a lot to analogy, and that's what I'm going to talk about today is one of my favorite analogies. But I mean, I turn to things like biological systems or mechanical systems or philosophical systems, whatever I can find, that helps us to understand the challenges we're facing and how we need to respond to them. And the one that I want to talk about today, the challenge in particular, is the challenge to innovate. And the nature of that challenge is that the high-value things that we can produce are often on the innovation edge. And so for a company like Cisco, and I would imagine for a lot of your companies, the margin at which you're able to sell things is really important. And the high-end value at which you're able to sell things is really important. If you get into a cost-cutting competition with China, you're in a bad place. But if you can get into a value competition in that situation, that's a better place to be in. And how you innovate and the rate at which you innovate is critical to being able to do that. So my problem is the question, how do I create an operational function that can be the platform upon which innovation can happen? And so the analogy that I've turned to is that works best for this it's an analogy around military strategy. And that's where Colonel John Boyd comes into play. in the U.S. military in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. He was unlikely, partially because he was abrasive and he was obnoxious and he smoked cheap cigars and he spoke a little too much truth to power. But he was also unlikely because he was a fighter pilot. And he was probably one of the best fighter pilots in the United States in the 50s. In fact, arguably, based upon all the dogfights he had, he was. And a fighter pilot is not considered an intellectual in the military. It's kind of like being a jock on a university campus. You were recruited because you could pass a football. Nobody expects you to actually do real theory. And he actually did a lot of theory based upon math. And the one thing that really drove him, I think, besides wanting to do good things for the military, was his constant desire to find the more general description of a problem and a more general solution to the problem. So first, he wrote a tactics manual on fighter pilots and how to fight a fighter. But that wasn't enough for him. That was a book like, this thick. He had to fight the military establishment to get it. In fact, for his whole career, he was fighting the military establishment to get his things adopted. But he ultimately did. But the problem was that he didn't like this big book. And he thought, and he eventually distilled it down to a single equation, which he called energy maneuverability theory, which made it possible to predict the maneuverability of any jet fighter based upon a few key aspects of that jet fighter. The maneuverability at any altitude, at any speed. And based upon that, he was able to do an analysis of the U.S. fighters that showed that some of the fighters were outmaneuvered by enemy fighters at every altitude, at every speed, which you can imagine the military establishment did not like that analysis and didn't want to hear it because a lot of these were their pet projects. So that wasn't enough for him. He'd done something amazing with that. He'd actually revolutionized the aerospace design industry. But it wasn't enough. And what he noticed was that the maneuverability wasn't the whole story, because here many of our jets were not as maneuverable as the other jets. But when we went head-to-head against other jets, we won sometimes 10-to-1 ratio. And so his problem was, what is it besides sheer mechanical maneuverability that was making us win those battles? And so he took a look at these two jets, and one of the things he noticed was that the American jet had a bubble canopy, which meant that you could see more 360 degrees than you could in a MiG. And so part of it was your ability to observe, the ability to see what was going on in your environment. But the other thing that it made it possible to do was that the American fighter had hydraulics, and the MiG had mechanical steering. And so the rate at which you could observe your environment and then respond by pushing the stick left or right, the total maneuverability of the American jet was far, far better. And that, he felt, accounted for the ratio of wins. And so, never satisfied with a specific theory when he could do a more general theory, he started applying this to all of military strategy. And he came up with something that's going to be very hard to see on the screen. But you can look it up on Wikipedia and you can learn all about it. But this is the OODA loop. And he said that the way to win in a competitive environment is how quickly you can observe, orient, decide, and act. It's the whole loop. It's the loop from being able to understand your environment to being able to understand where in your environment your enemy is, how quickly you can make a decision, and how quickly you can act. And that this is happening at high levels and low levels in every system that's a competitive system. And so he took a look at all of the military fighters who had ever, all the way back to Hannibal, and he looked at those places where a smaller force had beaten a larger force. And he was able to show that it was the tempo at which the OODA loop was executed that made all the difference in winning in a competitive situation. So, if you could quickly observe, orient, decide, and act, you'd win a fight. And so you can imagine this in a jet, because it makes total sense in a jet, which is that if you're in front and somebody's behind you, and you can go up, and they're a little bit slow, and then you go down, and they're a little bit slow, and you go up, and then pretty soon, they're 3 steps behind you, was talking about with this idea of the OODA loop. But applied to military strategy and ground fighting, which of course this is another place where he had a real challenge with because here he is as a fighter pilot and he's telling ground fighters, infantry, how to behave. What he realized is that the thing that makes this OODA loop slow was partially the way that communication happened and the fact that military organizations are command and control. And so imagine that my fingertips are platoons out in the field. The way that it works traditionally in traditional military doctrine is that there's a command and control at the center. And each of those fingertips needs to report in. Here's what I'm seeing, here's what's going on, tell me what to do. And the ideal one of these platoons out here at the edge was somebody who would listen to orders and just do it. The problem was that the cycle time from when information came from the fingertip to when it got to the command and control was all collected in command and control and then sent back out to the fingertips. By the time that happened, all of the information that had been supplied to the command and control was obsolete. And so then what he realized was that you need to empower the fingertips. So you need the people who are at the edge, know what's going on the ground. You need to give them the ability to act and the freedom to act and the knowledge of why they're acting. And so what he called that instead of command push, he called it recon pull, which is there you are, you're a platoon, you're out in the field, you see an opportunity, and how do you go after it quickly? You just go after it, you don't ask permission, but you call laterally to the platoons on the right and left of you and say, look, I found an opportunity, and everybody falls in behind you. And so this was very, very challenging for the military. It was challenging for the military because, when you're responsible for something, you like to be in control. I'm responsible, I want control. The problem was that control was slow and uninformed. And because it was slow and uninformed, it felt risky to actually let the platoons be independent and self-directing. But the truth was, this is a case where risk is prudent. We're taking some risk and allowing freedom as opposed to control. You can get faster response times. And by being faster, you can be more disruptive. You can see an opportunity and you can go after it. And so there were a couple of really big ideas that were very helpful for me in thinking about, okay, the fingertip groups are like innovators in a company. And if I want to create an operational situation that's going to enable them to be quick, to be able to see an opportunity and go after it, these concepts really helped me to think about it. And these are the ones. And I'm hoping somebody here speaks a little bit of German. So, first of all, what he saw was that the command and control orientation was always based around a map. And so commanders were looking at a map, and because they were looking at a map, they started to think about taking terrain, because it became a thing about fighting terrain. And they would say to their people, take Mountain X, but they'd never tell them why. But why Mountain X? Because it was part of the terrain, and they were trying to control terrain. What he said was, you're not fighting terrain. You're fighting people who are also going through an OODA loop. And if you can go faster than their OODA loop, you will completely disarrange them. Every time they think they're responding to something, it'll be over by the time they respond, and you'll be off blowing up a bridge or doing something else. And so you're not fighting terrain. So the mental model about what you're doing is completely different. I mentioned before, it's the tempo of decision-making that makes a difference. Recon pull, we talked about it. Schwerpunkt, somebody can probably say that better than I can, which is that if you have those people out in the field who are free to do what they think is right, they need to know what right is. So there needs to be a focus of effort. You don't give commands to the troops based upon take hill number X. You give commands to the troop based upon, we think you should take hill number X, but that's because there's a supply line on the far side of it, and our objective is to disrupt that supply line, and if you can disrupt that supply line, do whatever it takes. And so what happens is, in is what people in the field have that people in control in the center don't have. And you need to rely on that fingertip feel. So this combination of fingertip feel, main focus of effort, freedom to act, those things come together to make it possible to compete very quickly. And so mission orders are the way that you tell people what to do, not simple orders. So what does this mean? Now we've got this big analogy in front of us. What does it mean to a business? Well, I'll give you examples from my world. So let's say I'm a manager. I'm an engineering manager, or I'm an engineering project lead, and I see a technology opportunity that I know, because I'm an expert in the field, is a fantastic market opportunity. And I'm in a company in which I'm empowered to go pursue that opportunity. So in order to pursue it, I need some people to pursue it with me. I need to assemble a team. So I go to HR, which is the organization that I do operations for. I go to HR and I say, look, I'd like to open a job requisition for somebody. Now that job requisition goes into a massive command and control environment. 16 approvers later,